Hello and welcome to the ever invariably and affectionately yours Ann Lister correspondence session today. So today we get to jump into all things Ann Lister's correspondence and talk about the Letterbag project. I've got about 27 and a half hours of content to cover in 45-ish minutes. With a Q&A. So I will try and move through the content quickly. So during this presentation, feel free to drop all of your questions in the chat as we're going along. I will make sure there's time at the end for a Q&A so that we can talk through things. And then if there's any questions that we do not get to answer today, I will follow up and answer those at a later time. So today, I'm going to, like I said, talk about the Letterbag, talk about letters in the archives, the letter mechanics of how Ann Lister wrote, and letter writing in the 19th century. So the topic of letter writing, of course, is really extensive and covers all sorts of material. So there's the types of writing tools used, the inks used, how they were used, how your socioeconomic status affected your ability to write letters to people, and if you could even use the post and get your information to your family members and loved ones. Again, there's lots of stuff to cover, but I'm only going to hit on some major topics today, and then hopefully in the future there can be some more deep dives into all things Letterbag. Okay, so I'm going to start with the Letterbag project. So the letter tracker started, I got several of us had the idea, but I got inspired because one of the things I was trying to do, of course, was trying to find as much information firsthand from Mariana as possible, right? So the first place I went to was the archive letters. So and I realized that there were not very many at all when it came to Mariana. But in the journals, Ann Lister talks about letters all the time, right? Every day she's talking about a letter received, a letter written, writing letters, copying letters, all of that stuff. So I was like, there's got to be a way that we can track these letters to then compare to the journals and then also see if we can start finding some of these letters in other archives, right? So the Ann Lister's Letterbag started. We do know that Ann Lister did have indexes for herself where she would track her letters. And so that was, of course, the perfect place to start. And that was used to get the Letterbag started. So we started tracking, we used that, turned it into a spreadsheet, of course, used the spreadsheet to make it accessible for public use, in research, anybody to review, and the fact that anybody can contribute. So as of today, we have over 4,700 pieces of correspondence tracked in the Letterbag, which is amazing. And we know that that's not even half of it. Like, if you've ever looked at the Letterbag, which you can view on Packed with Potential, you'll see there are several volumes that don't have very many of the letters tracked. So just wrapping your brain around the 4,700 pieces of correspondence, right? Like, yes, we probably send that many emails in a few months sometimes, but as you'll see in a few more slides, the art of writing was a thing, right? And we know Ann Lister talked about how long it would take her to write. So it's just mind-boggling to me, 4,700 pieces of correspondence, and that is to Ann Lister and from Ann Lister. So the cool thing is that you can track all the to and froms and where they're coming from, and I'll touch on this a little bit later, but that opens up like so much information that people can use the Letterbag for when they're researching other Ann Lister content, right? Or Mariana, or Tib, or Maria Barlow, or Sib, all of those. Like, it's an excellent place to go for some information, especially when you're trying to find info of the other people. And this is a shot of the tracker with all of the volumes closed, but each volume lists all of the letters that have been added so far. And I want to say thank you very much to all the contributors for this, because that's the only reason that we have over 4,700 pieces of correspondence tracked, is because everybody and so many people are going in here and adding content from either blogs that they're reading or their own transcriptions. So this is one of those, another example of an amazing community effort that just has so much information for us to use outside of just talking about her correspondence. So moving on, I'm going to talk about the actual letters that do exist in the archives. So one of the cool things, right, is that the transcription project is finishing up. Like eventually we're going to have all of Ann Lister's pages transcribed and available for everybody to read, which is amazing. And the other thing that is sitting in there are the letters, right? So although these are not digitized and freely available online like her journals are, this is for people who want to continue to transcribe and love that whole bit of doing these sorts of things. There are lots of letters that can be transcribed. So there are the four sets of her letters that are divided by her correspondence. There's a grouping of Eliza Rain letters, correspondence with the College of Arms, and of course her business letters. And so one of the interesting things to know is that in the archive tracker, or I'm sorry, the Letterbag tracker, right, we've got over 4,700 pieces of correspondence tracked. In the archives, or in West Yorkshire archives, there are around 1,300 letters that are, viewable. So that just puts into perspective how many letters actually did existed and how many are, of course, either burned, because we know that she burned her letters, or how many are at other archives or hidden, in somebody else's personal collection that could be found, which is another amazing way to use the letter tracker when you are looking at other archives, right? If you're trying to find more information on any of the people in her life as they're getting tracked, you can see in the letter tracker where they might have been when they were sending letters to her. And that is an amazing starting point to go to those archives and see, oh, maybe this person has a collection of letters, because there could be more Ann Lister letters in other archives in all sorts of places. For example, there are Norcliffe letters in archives in the United States. So you never know what you're going to find, but having a resource like this, again, is just an amazing starting point. But so one of the things, of course, as I said before, the letters are not digitized, right? So they're not as accessible to people, but so you can order digital copies of the letters, or you can make appointments to see them yourself at the archives. A couple things to point out: the letters, because they're not digitized like the journals and freely accessible online, you have to have permission to share them. And so I've got a few slides coming up with some letter examples, but because I didn't ask soon enough for my permission to share them, I've got some of the letters blurred out. So just FYI, you'll notice that in some of the upcoming slides. But there are people that have been sharing letters, so you'll probably see them in various places, but just remember, as part of this world of respectful research, to make sure that if you are ordering digital copies or taking pictures from any of the archives, that you find out what their permission policy is about sharing. Usually, in my experience, from the various archives that I've ordered letters from, you usually have to sign something that says why you're using it and if and when you would share something. And then also always be respectful of copyright, of course. Sometimes you can have the copies or share bits, but they will specify like the sorts of things you can and can't share. Okay, so moving on to letter mechanics. And so this is the cool stuff about how Ann Lister wrote and how other people at the time wrote. So here is an example of a letter. And of course it's blurred, but you can see the structure, right? So one of the really cool things that they did, because sending post was expensive. For some people, very expensive. It would be the cost of some people's weekly wage. So trying to make sure that they were not using too much paper was important, because it was paid for by weight and like the number of pages you used. So they would take this large piece of paper and fold it in half. And so you can see on the right side is what you would call like the front page of the booklet, right? So like normal, the letter would begin at the top. You would typically find the location and date of where the writer is writing from and when. And so they would write it as if it's a book, right? So they fill in the first page, turn it over, fill in the second half page, go over to the top and fill that. So that becomes 3 pages, right? You've got this first page you see, flip it over to page 2, page 3. And the example you see here on the left is actually like the back page of the letter booklet. So when she says, wrote 3 pages, the ends and under the seal, we've got page 1, the front cover of the booklet. You flip it over, page 2, page 3. And then even though this is still a page, because it's actually the front of an envelope, that's where she adds on the piece of information about the ends and under the seal. So what are the ends? So when before I had even started looking at any of the letters, I, of course, was reading, the books and transcriptions and blogs and stuff were out there. And for the life of me, I had no idea what any of this meant. And she just would say it all the time. And then I would find the information like, Mariana wrote 3 pages crossed and all this information. So being able to see this and understand this, which thank you, Amanda Price, for making this, because when I saw this for the first time, I was like, oh my gosh, now it all makes sense. So on that back page, which becomes the envelope, because at the time, envelopes were not used. So envelopes didn't actually come into use until the 1840s and later. So Ann Lister never had to worry about dealing with envelopes. You would fold these letters a certain way so they became an envelope, and you'd seal them with a seal. So on that envelope side, or the front of the envelope side, the ends become the ends of the envelope page. So you'll see it running along the top and along the bottom. And then the seal was used to close it. So of course, there'd be a little bit of area which you can see the text running vertically would be what would be under the seal. So most of the letters that I got that are between Ann and Mariana, they filled this entire thing. So you've got the 3 pages, and they end up filling up both ends and under the seal. So there is lots of words in their letters. On the next example, so here's another one. This is actually a Mariana letter, but you can see how she's got both ends, the top and the bottom, or the sides, whichever, when you're orienting it, and then the actual seal, and then the area under the seal. And some people, you'd only find a few lines or a couple lines. Mariana likes to pack that final bit on the end. So a lot of those are really tiny writing and just packed in there. But one of the other things that when you are looking at these letters, because of the location of the seal, if you look to the left side of the letter, you can sort of see a little area that looks like it's been ripped. So whether it happened at the time of receiving the letter or like, sitting in the archives, I don't know. But oftentimes in these letters, you'll actually see that piece of the other side of the page ripped out. So from that seal being closed over it. But it's usually small enough, but sometimes it will be in a important part of the sentence and you won't have the word you need and you'll have to guess. And that's happened several times in Mariana letters that I've transcribed. Another example of talking about writing. This is not an Ann Lister letter. This is a letter that isn't Creative Commons license that is free to use, but it's a really good example of crossed letters. Oftentimes she'll say something in the evening, wrote 3 pages and crossed them all, or crossed 2 pages. So what that is, which for anybody who has ever tried to transcribe a crossed letter, you will know the pain that comes from this, especially with the people who have horrible handwriting. Sutherland, Miss Marsh has horrible handwriting. Mrs. Norcliffe, not very good handwriting. Mr. Duffin. So the crossed letters, as you can see, this letter's on its side. So when they fill up these 3 pages and the ends and under the seal, if they still have more to say, but they need to keep their content or their letter weight short and not, or small, and not have extra pages, then they're going to find ways to fit the words. So what they would do is they would rotate the page and then just start writing along the cross lines of the previous. Sometimes you will get lucky and it'll be like this. It'll just be a few lines. They tend to write more fluid when they're crossing because it does make it a little bit easier to see. At least in my experience, I have yet to find like the tiny writing crossed. So it's almost as if they did understand that this is a lot harder. So I'm going to try and write better. Excuse me. But sometimes when they had lots to say, Anne, Mariana, Tib, they would cross all 3 pages. So you would have to read the first page, and then the second page, and then the third page. And then depending on in the order they did it, you might have to go to the ends and under the seal, or they would restart on page 1, as you see here. And then you start technically on page 4, turn it 5, 6, and this is the mess that you end up with. And so anybody who loves a transcription challenge, if you are into transcribing letters, go out and find all the crossed ones because these can take hours, especially if they're writing about, of course, topics that, just like when it comes to transcribing Ann Lister, and you have to go and research stuff that's like, what are they even talking about? But on top of that, so many of them had really bad handwriting. But here's another example. This, again, not an Ann Lister letter, one that was free to use. But again, she writes 3 pages, all crossed, and the ends. 1 line of crypt, bidding her trust me and remember she was my life, my love, my wife, very affectionate, but might be seen very well. So I like there that she actually adds that she included the crypt, but all crossed. So imagine reading technically 6 pages, like having to read 6 pages like this. It's a fun challenge. Okay, so some of the things that Anne records, excuse me, she records, of course, how long it takes her to write letters. And here's an example of writing that from 5 1/4 to 6 1/4, wrote 3 pages. So when you are thinking about like what you could get from this, like the letters and the Letterbag tracking, like these are just some of the things that you can use for other pieces of research, right? So how long it takes to write letters, how many letters she sends and receives each day, Sometimes she'll literally just add a line, at the end of her entry or at the beginning, that says like she took a letter to the post that she was writing the day before, or that she had one of the servants take it to the post. She also, so when she sends it, and also who she sends the letters with to the post. So that is one of the other cool things that is just, some, you could say random facts, but it is very interesting that she points out who she sent the post with into Halifax to make sure it was there in time for the coach. So next, letter writing in the 19th century. This, of course, affected sort of how and Lister did things. So there is a lot of information out there on the different equipment and stuff used for letter writing. I am not going to spend a whole lot of time on that because, again, like I said, there's like 37 hours of content that you could go into. But if you're into letter writing and the equipment used, it's really, really fascinating. Like they use the travel boxes. Like imagine every time you go somewhere, you have to lug around this big, heavy wooden box full of all of your writing utensils and writing supplies, and your wax and your ink and your different kinds of paper, which it's fun also seeing the different types of paper people use, right? Like sometimes I know I've heard like some of the people who might have a lot of money, but they end up using cheap paper all the time. And of course, when you end up trying to transcribe a 200-year-old letter that is written on cheap paper, it bleeds. And then of course you end up getting like what looks like a crossed letter, even though it's not. So imagine taking that really cheap paper, the ink bleeds through and it was crossed. So it's just, you never know what you're going to find when you're looking at these letters, which is one of the amazing things about it, right? You get to see this, you get to see their experience and what was happening directly from them. But if you're interested in the equipment, there is tons to research. So, and a cool place to start is the Letterbag, because you can see if she talks about like what she had to do with letters or the wax and the steels. That is a fascinating topic in itself. And we've got some people who are really into using wax seals, and also doing the Inktober challenge this month with the wax seals. So that was another thing that would be awesome to share. But again, just like with the letters, you have to have permission to share. But a fascinating topic if anybody is interested in researching that area. So going into the more of the letter writing, right? So we've got the post, right? And Lister talks about the post, the mail coach, writing on it, catching it in Halifax to receive people or to send off her post. And so the history of the post is actually really interesting. So thank goodness before Ann Lister came into the world to write, John Palmer actually transformed the postal service. So before that, it was very dangerous. There were not any postal roads. You could maybe never get your mail. People often had to pay more money to get their mail. So it was even more of an elitist activity. But after John Palmer came along, so they started to have increased security with mail guards. There were dedicated post roads built. So as you'll see when Anne is talking about sending and receiving letters, and you can see the dates, it usually took like 1 day for her letters to get back and forth to York or to Lawton, sometimes 2 or 3, but mail could move very quickly. So that's why you're able to see her sending and receiving a lot of correspondence so quickly, because of these improvements and those dedicated post roads. And in the original days, of course, they used the post boys, which weren't necessarily just boys or just kids, but they would be individuals that were making money delivering posts between cities and estates and towns. And they still use those. So you might see Ann Lister talk about like giving something to the post boy or getting something. And that is because they still use that if by chance you missed the mail coach, right? Or you missed the mail. She also talks about writing or, using it as transportation, which you could do. You could, it was cheaper, but it was also very dangerous. It was it moved very quickly. It was not very fun. It was like they wouldn't even stop for bathroom breaks, which we've seen Ann Lister talk about those having to go to the bathroom on the coach. And that's one of the reasons why, because their whole purpose was to deliver mail. So you just happened to get lucky if you wanted to pay extra to write on it. And so a little bit more about the sending and receiving. So the recipient was required to pay postage, like I said before, and that was based on the weight and the number of papers. And they did that because in the earlier days, if I paid my letter to be sent and I gave it to a post boy, he could take that money and run off. So they created some proclamations that said this was the new law and that you could actually be jailed if you did not deliver the letters that you were paid to deliver. Another interesting fact is they did not use postage stamps until 1837 and later, when it was actually invented, the stamp glue. So that's why they just used the wax seals and paid for the post at the time of delivering or receiving. And then it wasn't until 1829 that the first actual mail facility was built. So you'll notice after 1829, mail gets even quicker. And again, something that you can track in those deliveries. So what can you learn from Ann's letters? Okay, so these are just some of the questions that I have that if I had tons of time, I would be spending researching. So does Ann Lister's correspondence habits change over the years? How do the advances in the Postal Service affect her habits? Again, since the mail was paid for by the recipient, are there noticeable differences between how and when people write to Ann versus how she writes to them? Because remember, most of the people she hung out with had more money than her. So are there patterns where you can see like maybe they were more aware of what they were sending her versus maybe what she was writing to them? How did the Postal Service improve? And just, of course, my own personal, who has more elegant handwriting, Mariana or Tim? But there are endless questions. So yeah, the Letterbag is perfect to get started. And so to end, this is my favorite, one of my favorite Mariana quotes, and she's talking about writing. And this is when her and Ann have sort of not been writing much. Ann's not returning her letters and not writing as often. And she says, "You are right. Man does not live by bread alone, nor friendship by scribbling. But nevertheless, a little bread and a little scribbling are both very necessary in their way. As long as one treads the same soil, so long as one knows a few hours can bring us on the threshold of those one's loves. Idleness in writing seems a small offense, but where centuries of miles and oceans divide those who care for each other, interest becomes deeper, anxieties thicken, and in proportion as one feels this to be the case, it is difficult to believe oneself much cared for if a letter is neither written nor desired." So that is a very long and dramatic way to say, write me more. So to take away, if you can, order letters, have fun transcribing the letters, track letters, check the letters that have been tracked, and use the letters for your research because you're going to find so much amazing stuff in there and amazing starting points. Okay. What is the time check? I did not see. Oh, just got it. Perfect. Okay. So I know I went through that quickly. I was trying to make sure I did not run over. So I'm going to say, let's do the Q&A. So if you want to raise your hand, or you can either pop it in the chat or feel free to raise your hand and we can call on you and you can unmute yourself if anybody has any questions. I know there was, I was trying not to look at the chat while I was talking. So if anybody wants to repeat some of their questions. Oh, I see 2 hands raised. Leah Cohen. Yeah.
I'd like to know, did Anne Lister or anyone else actually struggle to read the letters that they received? Because of course now they have to be very carefully transcribed, especially the cross letters. So were they just more adapted to reading those kinds of letters?
Oh gosh, that's a good question. I do not know the answer to that. I would imagine it's something they're used to. But again, it could be something affected by their eyesight. But I know, yeah, when you're trying to look at that, and even like doing it, you know, on your computer where you can zoom in and zoom out, like it really is so hard to read some of those words that are just nonstop crossed over each other. But yeah, I don't know. I know in my Mariana research, I don't remember coming across anything where she talks about like your letter was too hard to read, or, you know, some comment like that. But that's a really good question. Is there anybody else want to? Ooh, in the chat, yes. So I've seen apologies for scrawled handwriting in some letters. And actually I saw that when I was reading up on the practices of letter writing back then. So that was actually a common thing. Like even if your handwriting was not bad, like you would typically start your letter with like either apologies for the scrawled handwriting, apologies for this late letter, even if it wasn't late. Like that was sort of like a norm of how you would start letters to certain people. Okay. Anybody else want to pop a question in the chat? Oh, I see 2 new messages. Oh, a hand raised. Go for it.
Yeah, I just wondered, so you talked about how you have to kind of often pay for these letters. What's the going rate for a letter these days?
Like when you're ordering them to transcribe, or when they pay to receive them?
When you're ordering them to transcribe them.
So each of the archive services have different pay charts, and from the archives that I have seen, they usually list those on the website. So it could be anywhere from like $1 a page to $2 a page. And some of the archives also track like what they count as pages differently. So sometimes it will be like per scanned letter. And then other times, like with West Yorkshire Archive Service, that is actually by the number of scanned pages. So most of the letters.
Yep. Lost the sound.
Yep. Most of the letters you'll get ends up being 2 scans, right? Because it's a folded in half booklet pretty much. So they'll scan the first page, that's a file. They'll scan the second page, that's a file. So like in my Mariana collection, I think there's only 1 letter that is like 3 scanned pages, but most of them are a scanned front page and the scanned back page. So you end up with the 2. And it's really great. I have like the archives are so amazing and so helpful. You know, if you're just looking at 1 letter, you can order 1 letter. If you do buy your letters in bulk, just know that there is, like with West Yorkshire, there is a bulk processing fee that is there. So as you're going along, yeah, just check with the archive that you're dealing with, but they'll answer all those questions, and they'll give you the price too before you actually order. But that is one of the bummers, that they're not digitized yet. I see another hand. Jane. Oh, mute.
Unmute.
Oh, there you go.
I finally got it. I noticed in transcribing, that Ann Lister will often mention how spaced out the writing is in a letter. And she'll say, wrote 3 pages, very small and close, or received from Mariana a letter, very small and close, and how many pages. And she seems to take this as an indication of how much the person loves her, or how much she loves the person. That if it's a letter where she'll say, a few hurried lines from X, she seems to devalue that. And when she notes that she's received a long letter that's very small and close, that seems to be important to her. And I wondered if you had seen that elsewhere. Is that strictly an Ann Lister's own insecurities kind of thing? Or have you ever seen any mention of the density of the handwriting as an indication of anything?
Yeah, well, first of all, so that's awesome that that's something that's like noticed in her, that you're able to notice in her habits of writing. So I have noticed that some letters are like very tiny written. I have not like I guess paid enough attention to Anne's reactions to them. So I didn't know that was a thing, which that's very cool to know. But because also we only have everybody else's perspective through Anne, like there is one letter of Mariana. So quick important piece of information. So there's only like 14 letters that physically exists in the archives that are from Mariana to Ann Lister. And if you look in the letter bag, so far there's over 1,000 tracked. So how sad is that? Second, so yeah, so with those people, like you don't get to see really their side, but off the top of my head, I can't remember like any of that kind of stuff standing out. Like they would complain to each other a lot about not writing fast enough and not getting that post quick enough. And
she seems to comment on the density of the handwriting, the length of the letter, and also how intimate the content is, particularly with Sabella McLean. She'll say, received a letter, very small and close, 3 pages, the kindest, the most affectionate one I've ever received from Sabella. And she'll note that, and then spend days preparing her response. Sometimes she would take 3 or 4 or 5 days to write back to Sabella. And in that time, she'd be doing research to impress Sabella with whatever they were, because they had these various theological conversations, for example, where they went off on this long binge about writing to each other about the meaning of Hades and Gehenna and hell, and what it all meant, and is there an afterlife, and is there an underworld? And Ann Lister, before she would respond to one of these letters, she would go off and read Greek texts and the Latin Old Testament in the original, and try and dig out this information so that she could impress her girlfriend, basically, and then write back very small and close, and recreate the entire letter in her journal. It's really fascinating how much weight she puts on that kind of thing.
Yeah, I wonder with the letters that do exist, if sort of there are enough of them to be able to track that, like to take her responses, how she writes about what how they were written, and then where you can actually see for yourself what that letter looks like and how it was written, to sort of like see that. But yeah, that is very cool. And yeah, she definitely did some wooing. Went out of her way. How are we doing on time? Are we I see 2 other hands up. Feel free to unmute yourself. I'm scrolling to find you. But yeah, go ahead and ask.
Jane, this is Patty Book here. I was, in response to your comment, I was thinking that, didn't people pay for the letters based on either the distance traveled or whatever? So if you got a letter from a distance that cost you a bit and there were only a few lines on it, well, that would suggest something about the person who sent it to you, that they weren't being sensitive to the fact that you were paying well for not much, I guess is the point.
Yeah, so in the beginning, so distance before like the post roads happened and they started making that, so distance was a factor in there. But then as time went on, it really did become like the weight of it. Now, if you were using like your own post boys and stuff, because either you weren't in an area where the postal roads came, that might have still been a different, but once they started standardizing it more, it was the weight. And one of the reasons they made the recipient pay was to make sure that the letters actually got there, versus paying for. And the other cool thing is Anne usually talks or mentions sometimes like how much it cost. Now I've noticed like when I've been tracking all of the communication between her and Mariana, it's not like a normal thing I've noticed. But she does mention it sometimes in there. So like it would be possible to sort of like track how much those costs were back and forth. Okay, is that another Jane?
Am I unmuted finally? Yeah. One thing she does mention pretty often, and maybe I don't really understand what this means exactly, but it has to do with the cost of receiving a letter, apparently, is she'll say that the person who sent her the letter, that it was franked by some government official or some relative in a high place. And, you know, she seems to appreciate it and like it when somebody sends her a letter that's been franked. Do you have any idea what that's all about?
Yeah, so the little bit that I found, that was, I think, the practice of when, if you were an official of any sort, you could use the mail for free, the postal service. And so if it was sent by somebody who had that option, the recipient didn't have to pay for it. So if you had friends that were, you know, an official in some capacity that had free mail service, then you could get letters that way.
So this is like your employee discount and you've given it away to other people, so probably not kosher, but
Yeah,
you know,
exactly.
Vera seems to be you know, quite expert at getting her letters franked by this person or that person. And Anne's always very happy to note that and who franked it and, you know, that sort of information. Yeah.
Yeah, it would be interesting to know with how much, of course, we know how many letters, like so many letters, like what that ended up costing. Like if there was over time a really good way to find all of those figures. Okay, I think there's one last question I just see in the chat from Janet Priest. Have you found out anything interesting about Mariana from your research in letters that you didn't already know? So the information that I found about her after Anne's death does come from a lot of those sources and the people that she knew, because of course we don't have Anne's firsthand. A lot of times Anne will make copies when her and Mariana are exchanging letters that have like really deep stuff, but there's just normal day-to-day stuff too. Like I found out that some more details about Mariana's hatred for Reverend Ford, and how she did all she could to get him kicked out of being the Reverend of Lawton. So there is lots of little good tidbits in there, but again, the ones that I found at the Yorkshire, or that are at the Yorkshire archives, there's only like 13, and then I found a few others that are located at some other archives, but there's not a lot. So with that kind of content, I've had to go to the transcribed journals, where Anne, thank goodness, has copied lots of the Mariana content. Okay, I think we are at the top. Oh, what's the best place to start with a year? I would start with whoever your favorite person is and go from there. Okay, thanks everybody.